Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Jive to SharePoint / Office 365 webinar. I appreciate you taking your time out of your busy day to come join us and talk about this subject. What we wanted to talk about today was sort of 10 things that folks should know about migrating from Jive to SharePoint Online. And in general, I'll just say SharePoint Online, and meaning a part of Office 365. I have two of my experts. I'll call you guys experts. Is that okay?
Yeah. No, Chris, an expert.
I have one expert here. I have Chris Edwards, who's a senior software engineer for ThreeWill, and he is the chief architect of the initial version of the tool, and has was the grandfather of the migration tool, and has helped it to grow through the years. And we also have Kirk Liehmon here with us. Kirk is a principal software engineer, and Kirk is the practice lead for our migration practice. So Kirk has been very involved in various types of migrations, and more recently has been doing some Jive migrations himself, right?
That's right.
Awesome. So what I felt like getting us kicked off with, and maybe let me do a couple logistical things before we do this. If you've got any questions, you can ask some questions in the GoToWebinar interface, and I'll look over there and check for them every once in a while if we've got some time in the end, which we probably will. I'm assuming this won't go for the full hour. I'll check those questions and ask you guys on the fly. I'll make sure they're not too tough questions. You guys would both look at me like, you didn't pay me enough to do that.
Bring it on. Bring it on.
All right. Well, we'll see. If you have any questions, ask them. Love to have some interaction with you guys as you're watching the webinar. So first off, I thought there's a book that's called Begin with Why. Why don't I start with a why question? Why are companies doing this? Why are they moving from Jive to Office 365 / SharePoint Online? Kirk?
Sure, I'll start, and if Chris wants to add stuff, he can. I think the main one is to save on costs. So Jive is not cheap. Not that SharePoint Online is super cheap, but Jive is not cheap. It has recurring costs every year, and a lot of times companies want to go to SharePoint. They already have SharePoint in-house, or they might already have SharePoint Online. Right. And of course, SharePoint Online, a lot of people think is relatively cheap. And so I think when you look at that cost standpoint, you see, oh, well, can we do a lot of what Jive does in SharePoint? You can do quite a bit of it. Mm-hmm. So they think, well, maybe we could save on cost by having everything in SharePoint. And another aspect of that is if they're going to SharePoint Online, they see a lot of what it has to offer. There's kind of new features coming out all the time. Yep. With Teams and Delve and just different types of things that are coming out, groups, those things. So if they want to take advantage of that, they think, well, if we just start having that as kind of our main place to collaborate and not have a separate Jive environment, then we can hopefully take advantage of more of those features that are out there in SharePoint Online.
And there's a lot of redundant features I know with Yammer too, with people seeing what Jive does with the whole activity feeds. I think probably a lot of people are saying, well, do we want to use Yammer as sort of our way of interacting with each other socially?
Yes. Yeah.
So. So they also see a lot of, it seems like a lot of the features that are coming down the pipe from Office 365 seems to be getting faster, not slower.
Right.
I know for us it's one of those things, and this initially, when you were looking at Jive versus SharePoint, it was Jive was coming up with quarterly updates, so they were pushing software out quicker, and SharePoint had the 3-year cycles, and it was like you'd wait every 3 years to get your new set of features. But I think in a lot of ways it's reversed a little bit. You're getting pushed out more features from SharePoint. So you're not having to wait the 3 years. You're constantly getting updates. So as far as innovation goes, there's a lot of things that Microsoft is really pushing with regards to SharePoint Online. Yammer not so. I mean, Yammer seems to be pretty.
Yeah, Yammer's not changing that
Pretty.
much,
Yeah, it's you know, pretty stable. Tommy and I talked about that a lot. Do you think that the Yammer team probably had more to do with changing how they deliver software than the actual Yammer software itself?
Right.
But you know, you're seeing a lot of people saying, well, I want to take advantage of the latest software, whatever the latest software trends are, twins are. I turned into Elmer Fudd there. The latest trends are in software, and we're seeing a lot of those come from Office 365.
Yep.
So there's also, if you search on our site or search our Google business case Jive 3will, you'll see a blog post that I put out, which was sort of the business case behind why I see people doing this, and that gets updated all the time as far as what the story is around that. So, numero two.
Right.
Let's go with, you know, with these projects, we like starting things with a workshop. Describe to me what goes on during one of these workshops.
Yeah, once again, Chris, if you want to chime in, feel
Sure,
free. But I'll start it out. So this is Kirk. So the first thing I think we want to do is understand what the vision of the client is. What do they want to get out of this? Why they want to move? What is it they want to move? And then after you kind of understand that overall vision, then you want to dig in deeper. So you want to understand their current environment. So what do they have currently in Jive? What version of Jive are they using? Is it the one that's up in the cloud? There's hosted versions of Jive. There's on-prem versions of Jive. And ideally, before we even do the workshop, and this has happened many times, but sometimes it doesn't happen before the workshop, we can do an inventory of what they have in Jive before the workshop. That's the ideal scenario. And if we do that, we can review what we know about their inventory. Okay. So our inventory will give them counts of different types of content, counts of places, and we can kind of slice and dice that different ways, and that's very, very useful. Absolutely. So if we see, for example, they're heavy users of Jive Collaborative Documents, then we can kind of tailor the migration, or at least tailor our discussion in the workshop on here's what happens with a Jive Collaborative Document when you migrate it. We want to understand what customizations they have. Do they use heavy branding in Jive? Is that what they kind of want in SharePoint? Do they use Jive plugins or widgets or tiles? Those are important points to discover. And with all this stuff, you need to understand user identities and how that's going to transfer from Jive to SharePoint. Typically, you have the same email address as your login. If you're going to SharePoint Online especially, you'll have to use an email address, but Jive can or doesn't have to. And so you want to understand if that's going to match and how that's going to work. So you also understand their current state in SharePoint. Are they going to a greenfield SharePoint? Are they going to SharePoint on-prem, online? What version of SharePoint? Do they have a lot of site collections already? And how they do search in SharePoint if they use it already? And of course, user identities there as well. I'm going to continue talking. I got more things to talk about. In this workshop, you want to show them a demo, at least screenshots of what the tool can do. So we've got a set of tools we'll talk about, I'm sure, and these we want to show them start setting expectations early of what the tool can and cannot do, and what are the supported types of content from Jive that we can migrate, and what are the types that aren't supported, and does that meet their needs? And finally, with the workshop, we want to come out of that getting a good understanding of scope. What is it they want to migrate? They aren't going to have all the answers right away, but what do they want to migrate? What types of content they want to migrate? How quickly do they want to migrate? And do they have anything that they want migrated that our utility doesn't cover, or certain aspects of it that it doesn't cover? So that will help us kind of come up with timeline and budget for the whole project.
Nice. That's usually, I know, one of the first things I ask folks to fill out, if possible, is a pre-migration form that's up on our website. And one of the things that drives a lot of these projects is the timeline, because typically you have a hard date that's out there that you're trying to get people migrated over by for that date. And we like to be, 8 to 10 months out before that date, but more realistically, you guys have seen, it's been, we've got a date set 3 to 4 or even sometimes less than that. And so you're almost trying to decide, really trying to deal with, normally our projects aren't this way, but you have basically you have to do something by a certain date. Right. You have to make sure that key things are done by that certain date, and it probably modifies a little bit as far as how we go after these projects, but just interesting to see that that's typically for us, the timeline is driving a lot of this. Now, from our workshops that we've done with the Jive stuff, have you noticed any, have people been using a lot of plugins? I know when way back when we created like an app for Jive, it was like a SharePoint list app for Jive. Are people, do they have a lot of customizations, and are they wanting to move those customizations over, or is it pretty much we just want the core content and that's all we're interested in moving?
From what we've seen, there's been very little customizations to Jive that we've been concerned about.
Okay.
But for the most part, it's the pure content, the documents, the discussions, yep. the heavy content that people don't want to lose. Yep. That's really what we're trying to retain in SharePoint. That's most of it.
But I'll add that the one we're working on now, they care about these home pages, yep. and these overview pages and tiles and widgets that Jive has that can be on these pages, and these are very custom things. So that's significant customizations to be concerned with. So
that's something we're thinking of. I mean, we've thought about some of that stuff and how we deal with it, but every customer is going to look at that a little bit differently. So and we found that to be the case.
One of the things I don't see, you probably also talk about, like I know with some of the migrations, we're not only just moving them over to SharePoint, but they're using something like, BrightStar's Unily or some other sort of UI that's on top of SharePoint as well. It's probably you're starting to set some of those expectations as well during the workshop.
Yes, that's a very good point. So we need to understand if there's other parties involved.
Yeah.
Do you care about some other third party you mentioned, Unily? Do you care about Yammer? Do you have a different media server or something for your videos? We've definitely seen that more than once. So those are things that need to come up during the workshop, so we understand, what the real requirements are.
Right. So we come out of that with a scope, timeline, budget decision to be made about going after this project, and then the phases are sort of the workshop, and then we have a pilot phase, and then a production phase, and then a sustainment type of phase that we go into. Good stuff. Next question about our own utility. I was calling it a tool earlier. I can't call it a product because it's not a product. Tell me about this utility that we use for migrating customers.
So actually, we've got a set of utilities that we like to use. First one, I think, is actually available for download on the website, the Migrator utility. So that's kind of the initial one we like to give folks. Essentially, it's a Windows-based utility. Someone can put in their Jive URL, put in their username and password, and essentially hit the run button, and it goes off. And it basically uses the same public REST-based API that Jive puts out there that our other utilities use. So it kind of gives us a sense, is there any issues with running commands, running the API with a specific username? Is there any issues with running that? We find issues quickly. But it also gives us a list, an account of how many places, how many repositories or places that a particular customer has in their Jive environment. So it gives us an overall size. What are the counts of different types of groups and spaces and projects, blogs? Those are the main containers or places, if you will, in Jive. So,
and that's the trial version of Migrator, which is downloadable off of our website.
That's right. So that's kind of the initial utility most folks will see, just to kind of get that initial sizing. The main utility that we have it's called J2SP for Jive to SharePoint. It's a console-based utility. It's originally written to keep things simple, very console-based. Doesn't need a UI because it's designed to focus in on purely getting content out of Jive and getting content into SharePoint. So what it actually does quite a bit of the work of our process. One of the things it does, I mentioned the public API from Jive. It does leverage Jive's REST-based API, so it uses the public API, which is important. One of the first things we go after, and we kind of mentioned the workshop earlier, one of the key things that it goes after is it produces an inventory of detail from Jive. Things like a list of all the people that are in Jive, all the places. So again, places are the groups, spaces, projects, blogs. And then within the places, it actually does what's called a shallow pull of content for those places. And I'll use the term shallow and deep. I'll kind of explain that here in just a minute. But the whole idea is that we want to be able to get that content in a form that can be presented in the workshop or presented to the customer and actually really detail out when content was last touched per place, how much content is really out there. You know, it really kind of helps us understand how to plan for the migration effort itself.
Nice.
Right? So shallow is basically saying, I want to go after the content. What by shallow means it just pulls at the API level, it just basically pulls some of the basic information about what the place has. It doesn't go down deep and do multiple calls.
Okay.
It doesn't, like if you've got a person, it may find that person, but it may not find what the roles that person is part of. It doesn't make the extra calls to do that. It's designed to do a quick hit against Jive to find that information so we can use it.
And the output of this is an Excel spreadsheet for the shallow? Or?
The output, yeah, so that's part of it. The primary output is to build our database. So
okay.
One of the things we do, you kind of mentioned earlier about this whole, timeline aspect. A lot of customers come to us, they're at the last minute trying to migrate off of Jive, right? So what we try to do is we pull this content, this inventory content into a SQL Server database and into the file system. And we do that so that we can quickly get the content out of Jive. Let's say someone's being turned off in the next week of Jive. We can get that content in our database in the file system, and then we've got what we need to do the migration. So we
and that's doing a deep or shallow?
Well, that is more the deep side, but the shallow pull is going to get the inventory piece. The deep pull that you're talking about, that's when we actually go after and get all the physical binaries. That's where we get all the subcalls. Like I mentioned earlier, we go get a person, we get their roles, we get all the different aspects of it. But I mentioned this because more from an architectural perspective is that we are able to use this utility to go after, produce this database, produce the file system. We can go after that stuff first, get everything off of Jive, and if for some reason they're shut off in the next day or two, we've got everything we need to do the migration. So that it kind of ties into, they need to get this done quickly. We have the ability to kind of align ourselves.
So a pull usually takes a couple of hours, a day?
It really depends on how many places. It can take days.
It can take days.
It can take days depending on how many places we're talking about, how much content we're talking about. But we've got ways of kind of going after that. Utility does try to do things in parallel, does try to do things as efficiently as possible to pull that information off of Jive. So that's one aspect of what the utility does, this J2SP utility. Another aspect is what it is also designed to do is it'll take that inventory. And let's assume the customer has gone through and done what's called a mapping exercise. You mentioned the spreadsheet earlier.
Yeah.
We do produce a spreadsheet for that inventory that kind of says, here's all the stuff, all the places that are out there. Here's the customer needs to see this inventory. The customer typically goes through and says, I want these particular places, and I want them to be mapped to this place at SharePoint. Right? There's an exercise we work with the customer on to do that. So that mapping exercise. Right? Then the utility takes that mapping and says, okay, I need to validate, do these SharePoint sites, these target SharePoint sites we're putting the push content to, do they exist? So the utility verifies that where we are intending to push content, does the site exist, and do I need to push permissions or adjust permissions on these sites? It can do all that work.
Nice.
And then two other main pieces of activity that this thing does, we do what's called a transform phase. So we take the content as it was pulled from Jive, and we do what's called a transform. What that basically means is saying it's preparing the content to be pushed into SharePoint. So you may find in this content, you'll find a lot of links from Jive content to other Jive content, or links to Jive profile information, or just things that reference Jive in general. We take and convert that to SharePoint version, SharePoint speak. So a Jive person profile a URL may go to now to go to a Yammer profile, or it may go to a specific SharePoint URL that we care about that represents that person. as well as all the documentation, all the links get kind of converted into something that SharePoint can understand.
Nice.
And then
I love how each time you said transform, you were doing it like a robot.
Yeah, you like that? I got some hands. You guys can't see that on the
it,
phone, but I'm moving.
I'm
moving as I'm talking.
He was
here.
doing a bit of transforming with his hands in the air.
Transformers.
Sorry, go ahead. Number 4.
Yeah, and so the last main thing that the utility does, and I know this is a lot of information, but the last main thing is it's taking this prepared content and it actually will push it to SharePoint. And so that's when the actual content makes its way. So a couple other variations on this. We are able to do what's called deltas. So let's say we push this content to SharePoint and folks are still using the same place for that content in Jive. Then we may want to stage this stuff in SharePoint. Well, we can do what's called a true up or a delta, which basically says, okay, right before we're ready to switch over to using SharePoint, give me whatever deltas, whatever changes have taken place in Jive. Let's get them into SharePoint.
Nice.
Yeah, so we can kind of hit it multiple times to make sure it's in sync, and then someone can turn off Jive.
Brilliant.
So that's there. And there's a few other miscellaneous actions that probably more detail than anyone really cares about in this particular call. Some other utilities that we do. We have actually 3 PowerShell utilities that we use. One is called New Sites, and it's really a helper PowerShell that kind of helps customers basically provision their SharePoint site collections, things that we're going to be targeting for the deployment from Jive to SharePoint. Folks don't necessarily have to use this. It's just something we provide, and we provide the scripts to basically provision those site collections. And then we've got another set of utilities that kind of work hand in hand. One is called Validate Hyperlinks. It's also a PowerShell, and replace hyperlinks. So Validate Hyperlinks, what it does is it goes after we've migrated, post-migration, pushed up to SharePoint, we run this Validate Hyperlink to say, okay, all the links that are present in the content, we look at all the images, all the links, do they all jive? Do they all work? Overloaded term there.
Yeah.
Do they all work, and do they not rely on Jive anymore? Do they work without Jive in the mix? If they don't, we find the report of those that are failing, and we use the Replace Hyperlinks utility to make fixes. And so that's kind of our remediation efforts. So that's our main remediation. And then we go through, there's another set of processes, more processes and queries that we use to validate counts to make sure things that were in Jive are now in SharePoint. We make sure that the counts match, things match up properly. So that's the gist of it.
I just to mention there that the huge thing that this tool does is dealing with links that you have inside of Jive. So if you're writing a Jive collaborative document, it's very, very normal for people to create a link in there that points to some other Jive content.
Yeah.
Right? That's not that. It's, it could be pointing to another Jive collaborative document, or a Jive blog post, or something.
Right. And
something within Jive. The moment it does that, our utility, that's part of the transformation process Chris was talking about, it transforms those URLs to be the URL it's going to be or already is in SharePoint. It could be inside of a totally separate Jive place, going to a different maybe SharePoint site collection or site. But that's what these links are all, they're all fixed for.
Right. Yeah, that tries to clean all that up.
Impressive. Well done. I know this has grown through the years. It's sort of the tool, starting off with a long time ago, and it's sort of growing, but it's amazing how far along it's gone. So good work there. So for you, Kirk, what type of contents? We've been sort of talking a little bit around this, but what are the types of contents that we migrate?
Yeah, well, first off, Chris has already alluded to the different types of places in Jive. There's spaces, groups, projects, and blogs. Right. And there's some differences with those and how they work. But inside of those, you can have what we call content or sort of first level content. The big ones are collaborative documents, which are kind of like a wiki page in SharePoint if you aren't familiar with Jive.
Right.
There are binary files, which are just files like Word documents or PDFs or Excel files. There's also videos and photos. And then there's discussions, so it could be similar to like a Yammer discussion or a SharePoint discussion, list discussion those types of things. That's in Jive. And then blog posts. And we migrate all of those. And so those are the big content types. And there's some other minor content types that we currently don't, but those are the big ones and that people use a lot. And we do migrate those. And then within each of those, you can have comments or messages. For whatever reason, Jive basically says if you're commenting on a discussion, it's called a message. But you've got comments on these blogs or collaborative documents or what have you, and we migrate those. You might have attachments or embedded images on them. We will migrate, if we're migrating a whole Jive group, we'll migrate the members of that group and put people into basically different SharePoint groups for that SharePoint site. And I just talked about links, so we migrate those links that way to Jive content, so that they're now transformed to the new SharePoint links. And then things like timestamps of items and the created by, modified by, those types of things.
Those are migrated?
Yes. Yeah. Yep. So when you're looking in SharePoint and you see the blog post was created by so and so at such and such time, that's going to be
nice.
when it was created in Jive. And there's the cases where the user may not map over for whatever reason. Maybe it's a user that's now left the company. They're no longer in Active Directory. So there's some weird scenarios like that you have to get around. But for the 99.9% of them, things are going to migrate over with the user and the timestamp. And then we will archive some things that we don't migrate as well. An example of that is Jive. Jive has a concept of categories and tags. We archive that, so we have that information. Currently, we don't migrate that.
Okay, let me do the last little part. The part that we don't migrate. I'm going to do this like a lawyer speak at the end. This is the very last part of the commercial, right?
Well,
before
you say it, these are, and many times our customers don't care about these things, and these are usually not used a whole lot. So an example of one of these items, I think, is a poll. Sorry, I'll let you say
No,
it.
No, go ahead.
One of them, like polls, was the last inventory I was on, I think in their whole Jive instance, I could be saying this wrong, but I think they had 2 polls. They didn't have many of them, but polls might be the wrong one, but they had a very small number of ones.
Are they stored at all? Are they stored in the SQL Server database? Are any of these things available for later on if they need to go? If someone said, well, we had a poll, what did we ask in that poll, or those sorts of things? So some of them
Most of them are.
Why don't you rattle off the list?
Sure. Polls. Okay, here we go. Let me see how fast I can do this. Ready? On your mark, and get set. Polls, tasks, calendar, status updates, private messages, shared links, bookmarks, announcements, streams, overview pages, home pages, tiles, widgets, categories, tags, follows, profile properties, personal documents, space member security. Ding.
All right. So of that list,
but we'll migrate any of these for the right price.
But we are capturing.
If somebody needs to migrate this and we need to add it to the tool, then we can add it to the tool. It's just a lot of these. It just has the value of doing the migration hasn't been worth the cost, right? That's typically what we're talking through.
Well, it comes down, and I think we're probably going to talk about this in more detail later, is that SharePoint and Jive are not the same animal, right? These things don't really mean as much, or don't mean contextually anything in SharePoint, right? So, and a lot of them are, like for the case of a poll, that's very time sensitive. A lot of times these things are done, they're gone, they're done. They're completed and they're done.
Yeah, status updates, same way.
Status updates we actually do capture. In the database. We do capture tasks in the database. And the categories we capture in the database.
Shared links we capture.
Yeah, shared links as well. So those we actually archive, if you will, or capture them, but we just don't have any mechanism at this point to play them forward into SharePoint because they really don't translate into SharePoint. There are ways of representing them there, but nothing has been compelling enough to our customers to say, yeah, I want to go ahead and do that.
So it looks like we've branched over into question number 5, which is, do we create an archive?
Yeah. Yep. That's fine. Yep.
Basically, we do.
We do, and that's kind of what I alluded to earlier. Is the way the utility, the way the whole architecture has been designed, is that the archive is kind of baked in, right? So when we pull content out of Jive, when we do that deep pull of content. We can essentially do that for all places. And essentially what that does is it puts it into a SQL Server database. And for all the binary files, things like images, Word documents, like Kirk said earlier, Excel files, PDFs, that sort of thing, they're stored in the file system in a very structured way. The database actually has pointers to those files.
Okay.
And typically what we do is, we put all that together. We ensure that the customer has enough space to be able to retain all this information, and that we can essentially walk through it with the customer. So they can understand how the database is organized, what the schema is the database, how do we actually find these collaborative documents or these discussions or individual images. If someone wanted to know how to go after that, maybe they didn't migrate something to SharePoint, but they want to actually look at some content that was pulled out of Jive at a later date, how they go about doing that. So we sit down with the customer, show them actually how to access the database and be able to find that content in the database in their file.
But we sell them the database at the end of the project, right? We just hand it over? What is wrong with us?
It's already there. It's already done paid for it.
Yeah, you done paid for it, yeah.
Right.
Cool.
Yeah, so that's how that's done. I mean, again, we're trying to get the content. We want to be able to do stuff with it and be able to migrate it. At the same time, why not use that same phase to archive it? So same process.
Question 6, good. We're 30 minutes in. We may use up the full hour. Nice. Okay, that's fine. But this one I was sort of queuing it up a little bit earlier, which is the different phases of the project. And I mentioned the workshop, which we covered in some detail, then a pilot, then a production, then sustainment. Tell me more about these.
Sure. So first off, before the workshop, we'd like to do an inventory, as I mentioned, and that sometimes that there can be issues getting connectivity to work and stuff like that. So that can take 2 to 3 days sometimes. If there's no connectivity issues, then it can be a day, basically. It's not as bad, but many times there's connectivity issues.
Okay.
And that's just because of the security and how things are set up for some of our clients, but it just depends. And then the workshop itself is 2 to 3 days. So we want to sit down with you and discuss what this is going to be. It's a lot of, like I've seen, 3-4 hour sessions is one way of doing it.
Right.
I'm sure.
Not 2 full days. Not 2 to 3 full days.
No, they aren't
like
full days. Right. Yeah. And that helps us, get kind of, as we learn something from the first day, maybe we can, show you different parts of a demo or something the next day. Then after that workshop, that's when we're going to kind of come up with our scope and budget, hopefully. And one of those things that may be part of that may be in scope is updates to our tool.
Okay.
So that takes time, right? So, and what those updates are totally depends. But you rattle off that list of items that are not supported right now. We get the big ones that we think people really care about, and those other ones, maybe they've got an idea of where they want that to go, and we can talk about what that would mean and what that would take. So then after that, or at some point, it could be before or after those tool updates. If there's significant updates, we'll want to actually do more than one POC. But at some point, we need to do a proof of concept, and that may take a week or two. That's going to verify complete access to Jive and SharePoint. We're basically going to be running sample migration of several places from Jive to SharePoint, and we're going to basically end to end. We're going to see what happens, and then some people will get to see that from the clients. They'll want to take a look at that POC and what the output is. But after that is a pilot, and that's where you really get the business users and get them to get their input, and that's usually a couple of weeks to do a pilot.
And a pilot may have iterations within itself, right? So a pilot, you might do one. You really want customers' eyeballs on that, right? They want to make sure that people are seeing what they expect to see. They agree with it. There's any issues, is any content missing? But really make sure there's nothing like that's going to surprise the end users of this particular. And then if there is, and a lot of times there's stuff that we have to tweak or adjust. We typically do another iteration of a pilot to make sure things are corrected and fixed so they're happy.
Nice.
And move on to the next part of the process.
Yep, and then finally is production. Now, if there are a lot of tool updates, then there can be like multiple pilots and multiple POCs.
Okay.
We've seen that. But in production, that's where you kind of want to be full on moving stuff from Jive to SharePoint. But if you're going to SharePoint Online can throttle you if you try to go too fast. So Jive's going to have some limitations on how quickly you can pull their content as well. So Chris talked before about a shallow pull. When we do a deep pull, right when we're about to go to move a Jive place from Jive to SharePoint. So that's when we pull from Jive further if we don't pull everything way beforehand. But if you want like the latest updates in Jive when you're moving someone over, you would do that last minute. And that time totally depends. I think one way of measuring it is, say, 300 to 500 places, Jive places per week.
Mm-hmm.
But we've seen, I know we've seen one place that took, I want to say it was 3 days, that just to move one place.
Okay.
So now you can
Really?
do stuff in parallel, but that was a huge place, So it depends. When we get inventory, we'll have a better idea of what's possible.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the key thing here too is that, it comes down to that timing, right? So we want to have enough time to be able to move this stuff, from our transformed database and into SharePoint. Sometimes it takes a while because of the throttling, because of other things that can kind of affect your performance. The nice thing though is that, if we've got the time, we move this stuff into SharePoint. We let folks kick the tires a little bit. We can do that delta process or that true up process to kind of bring over the changes. So that allows that kind of like, let's get everything kind of up to speed, let's get everything in place, and maybe the weekend before you're converting over, you do your true up process and flip switch.
Now,
so there's ways of doing that.
I know sorry, this is a bit sideways, but I know some of the customers, they get a sort of, as they're wrapping up using Jive, they get a backup of their Jive database, and if we ever have we ever had to use that sort of as the thing that we're pointing to migrate data at all?
The actual Jive
The actual Jive database, so pointing that that database as opposed to a REST API.
No,
we haven't had to do
no,
that.
that's more of, we typically recommend that customers still ask Jive for that backup, just to have that.
Just to have it around.
As an extra, just to have it.
Yeah.
Because that allows them to spin Jive back up, right? If they ever, for some reason, needed to. It's more of just that extra guard. But no, we've never had to do that.
I just wonder if that ever is going to be the situation for us, and if that would end up occurring to us. So who knows?
Well,
we haven't had to exercise it quite yet.
So just from an experience perspective, we originally, this set of utilities was originally written for us to do our own three-wheel migration.
It's where all good things come. You scratch your own back, right?
Right. So when we first were doing this, we had some pain. We did miss some stuff, right? We didn't catch everything. So I had to go into the Jive database backup and learn how to do that.
Oh, really?
Pull stuff out of it.
Interesting.
So I've got some experience doing that, but we've worked hard to not have to do that. I'll say that much.
And if it's Jive Cloud, you're not going to have direct access to that database. So
you actually have to have
you have to have them create the archive.
I don't know what that process is, and if they'll do it for you. So.
Right. So it's possible, but we try hard to make sure that that's not necessary.
All right. Well, one thing we do is, we have had projects before, and I know Chris has done this directly, is we'd come back to a client and they say, you know what, we want these other 500 places to be migrated now. I know you didn't migrate them before, but you archived them, so you can migrate them yet, right? And then we say, yes, we can, because as long as you've got our database, the database our migration tool uses, then we can migrate to SharePoint later, as long as we did archive that content.
Nice. That's great to know. It's good to know you don't lose it.
No, exactly.
That is still available for you. So I get the easy one. Of course, I give the easiest question to myself, right, which is how much does it cost to do these migrations? Simple answer. We do the workshop is a fixed price, right now it's $7,500. Subject to change. I'm going to have my own lawyer speak to that. It may go up, especially if we're getting large backlogs of these workshops, then we may end up increasing that price. The typical migration, since we've been doing a bunch of these, the average size of these is the cost for the pilot in the production phases is around $150,000. So what that tells me is that typically we're working with mid to large size Jive implementations. For the smaller implementations, where I usually will coach them through or talk them through doing some manual migrations, or do you really need this, or we've been somewhat staying away from them and looking at only some of the larger clients who need to do these migrations. So if you ask me right away, which a lot of people do, they ask me, can you give me a quote for doing, this number of sites? If we don't have the time to do the workshop first, which the workshop gives us an updated estimate, I'll just tell them use 150K as the number, given limited amount of time, and especially we end up, that's around 1,000 places when we're working with that. If it's more, I'll end up jacking that number up. But at a high high level, that's what I want people just to have sort of an overall sense of what the budget is. And if that's too high of a budget and doesn't seem to make sense, it's probably because you have a smaller implementation of Jive, and completely understand, but I think we're more focused around large implementations, right? So done with that one. What are some of the, and if you need to create a business case for this or talk through why people have done this and some of the benefits, or want to talk to a customer about the benefits of doing this, we have all of those things. So feel free to reach out to me through the Contact Us page, and we can hook you up with the right people. What are some of the biggest takeaways from these type of migrations? And I guess this is open to the two of you guys. You know, what from doing these for now years, what have you seen as are some big takeaways?
You can go first. You
Yeah. So I would say that one of the big things just to understand is that Jive, and I've said this already before on this call, Jive and SharePoint are just not the same, right? They are different animals. They have a lot of the same elements to them. SharePoint offers a great opportunity to consolidate a lot of this Jive content, but they're definitely not the same. So, you have to make sure you plan for and understand your content types very well, so that you know kind of where this stuff's going to go. And that comes down to, I know we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but it comes down to just time, right? Give yourself time to understand this stuff. I can keep going through.
Well, along those lines, you just make examples. Jive has something called streams.
Right.
SharePoint doesn't have really that concept per se. Jive has shared content where you can share stuff from one place to another, but it only exists in one place, but it's just available from two places. SharePoint doesn't really have that. I mean, they have a concept of links, but and ideas. I missed ideas on the not covered list. I think it has something called ideas. SharePoint,
And you usually don't see that used very often.
Right.
I've not seen that really effective.
So just they're not like for like is a term I've heard a lot, and I don't like it. They are not like for like.
We don't like for like.
Yeah, it is apples and oranges. They are there's some stuff that makes a lot of sense to move over, and then there's some stuff that just doesn't work well, and it's kind of you're trying to force it in when you want to put it in SharePoint. And if it's something that's very important for you, then you got to really think hard about, well, does this even make sense for us to move to SharePoint? Or what are we going to do with this content? We can't do this in SharePoint the same way Jive did it. And so you really got to think hard about those things if they're important to you. So we talk about
other takeaways you guys have.
We've got them on here, but there's another option. There's opportunity a lot to clean up the content too. I mean, when you're moving from a system that's been around for a while, there's going to be some content that's just stale out there. There's things that may make sense to bring together from multiple places, multiple spaces in Jive into one location in SharePoint. Just basically a consolidation exercise. So this is an opportunity to be able to do some of that. Not that you have to, but it is an opportunity to take advantage of if you want to do that.
Yeah, and finally, when you do these migrations, you've got to make sure you're communicating with not only IT but the users. And I've mentioned this before on SharePoint migrations. Just you want to get your stakeholders involved. Everyone needs to be level set as to what's going on here.
Right. And we'll say that several times. Communication is key. Right? I mean, you're moving people's cheese around, so people don't tend to like it when you move their stuff, and so you want to make sure everyone's on the same page, everyone knows what's going on, and we have ways of kind of helping with that as well. So some of the stuff we can kind of share in the workshop and also in the actual migration. When do you communicate with folks? How often do you do so? We have techniques to help with that.
I think that's good that you mentioned that. I mean, one of our brand promises is around control, which is we want the client to feel like they're in control of what's going on. And I think a lot of those types of things are important because it does feel like you're moving somebody's cheat. You're moving a place where they collaborate from one place to another, and we can do these projects technically correct, but if we don't get the communication piece down, and also along with that communication, the expectation management from folks, then it can definitely fail. You can do a perfect technical implementation, but then it fail if you don't get the communication and expectation management right.
Yeah, if they expect see what here's what it looks like in Jive. I expect it to look exactly the same as SharePoint. That's the wrong expectation.
Yep. But I know we've also, along those lines, to address that issue, have done stuff where we're working with the Unilys of the world or other products to make it a little bit more Jive-like.
Right.
And also I know some of the clients had us do some branding or some things to make it
sure.
feel a little bit less jarring as you
Right.
make the move. So I think if that's something that's important to you, that's something we would talk about as well, is if this expectation of moving from this to this doesn't work, what are the things that we can do to make it work for you guys?
Absolutely.
All righty. Number 9, getting there. What advice would you give someone who is looking at this? This is probably similar to Insights, but what advice would you give to someone who's doing this? Besides, don't do this alone. Besides contacting.
Well, one you've kind of already mentioned is starting early and
Uh-huh.
make sure that we have time to make this happen for you. If we are rushed too much, then we're going to have to start, cutting corners. Oh, maybe we won't move over this type of content, or but these places that haven't been touched in the last year,
Yeah.
we won't move those because you're giving us a month to do things.
If you come to us a month ahead, it's like my kids say, you get what you get and you don't throw a fit.
Yeah. So you want to start early.
Nice.
And we mentioned the communication portion before. It goes back to that again.
Uh-huh.
Keep reiterating the same thing. I had another thought related to this, and I've lost it. So I'll let you
go ahead.
pick it up.
That's fine. Well, yeah, we've gone over communication. I mean, the other one that we've already talked about several times is a proof of concept and a pilot. These are key pieces of our process, and we can't cut those. Okay, and they're going to happen whether you say they need to happen or not, because we've got to basically prove that we can communicate in your environment and pull stuff from Jive and push into SharePoint, and then we've got to actually do a site or two that we get some feedback from before we start the full-on migration. So that's got to happen, and we need to plan for it. You need to make sure you're aware that that's part of the overall timeline.
Nice.
Yeah, and then a couple other things. So understand the content types. So you really need to understand what Jive content types are out there. What are people really using them for? What are they using? What are they using them for? Understand what your actual user base is doing in Jive, right?
Okay.
So that, and really, kind of in the workshop, we try to find out, okay, do we need to make customizations to SharePoint and/or the migration utilities to be able to handle those custom or those very specific use cases? I say customizations to the tools. Realistically, someone could go and build. Since we use the public Jive REST API, someone could go build something that's something similar to this. But there's quite a bit to understand, and it's very easy if you're not careful to make mistakes based on how they structure their things that come back out of Jive. And you can build it yourself, I guess is what I'm saying, but you'll run into some gotchas in that process.
I already have 2 examples of where someone wanted to try to build out the tool themselves and they failed.
Right.
So it's not not saying it can't be done. It can be done.
It's a public API.
But there's been years we've been doing things with Jive for now over 5, 6, I don't know how many years. It's probably been longer than that. Probably 7 years where we've been exercising stuff with first building the connector and just sort of working with it through the years, that there's a lot of built-in knowledge that has gone into it as well.
So, it's kind of giving just a little plug for, why would you choose us to do this? Because we've done it.
Yep.
We've migrated quite a few customers now, and we've got some experience, and the code has been poked at quite a bit.
And I didn't go through this earlier with the cost, is that we end up packaging in the cost of the tool into our services. And so when you're engaging us, what I like to say is for a solution, which is to migrate you from Jive to SharePoint Online. And we end up, the pricing for all of this, we're not a product company. We are working with the product company right now to see about transitioning our what we have as a tool over to them so it could be bought more like it's a tool. But we're in the middle of doing that right now. And so, as it stands right now, you're engaging us, our expertise, our tools that we have, in hiring us to do this migration, and the pricing is based off of what our services cost is. Last one. We're 10 minutes left. We have one question left. Well done, guys. You're working on and I also saw a question, which I'll have a question for you as well, which is great. Wonderful to see that. If you got anybody else has questions, please go ahead and ask them through the GoToWebinar interface. You're working on a white paper. I'm plugging your white paper here, Kirk.
Oh, good.
I'm plugging it.
I got to finish
That means you got to finish it. You're working on a white paper about complex migrations. How do these types of projects, the Jive migrations, influence what you're writing in the white paper?
Right. So that white paper is focusing on SharePoint to SharePoint migrations, but there's plenty of similarities between when you go from SharePoint to SharePoint and when you go from Jive to SharePoint. And they're usually the big idea or process type of thing. So your overall process has, we want to start with a workshop because we want to understand what you're all about, what you need, where you are today, and we want you to understand what we can do for you and what some of the caveats are and maybe what things we can't do for you. And I've talked about POC and pilot several times already over the last hour. That's true in both cases, and it's extremely important, and we talk about those in all of this in the white paper. We might word things differently in terms of our process. When we're doing SharePoint to SharePoint, we tend to use terms like assess, plan, verify, and execute, but those transition over to the same stuff we're doing here. And as Chris has said several times, the need to communicate is top on the list, and that's true in the white paper as well. So I think, that's awesome. That's pretty much it.
So guys, a couple of questions for you, and the first is, do you guys have an intranet in a box that sits atop SharePoint Online that we could map and migrate our selected Jive content into? Great question, and up to this point, the answer is no to that. We don't have something where we've built something on top, basically an intranet in a box on top of SharePoint. The reason being is there's probably 4 or 5, maybe 6 different options that are out there that we'd love to talk you through as far as what's available out there in the marketplace for this sort of intranet on top of SharePoint. We've mentioned one that we've been working with on a couple of projects, which is by BrightStar's Unily. Right. There's also other intranet in a box products that we've been talking to those companies as well. So rather than having something that competes with those, we'll work with whichever one you want to select. And so we will go through the whole process of, as part of the workshop, we'll talk through the process of how do we migrate that content, maybe not just into SharePoint, but also into some of other data stores, so some other places that you want to have the content go into. So great question. One of those things that we will work with another third party to, if you want to use one of those intranet in a box products, then we'll sort of work with you to select the right one if you want some help with that, or just point you to the ones. And I'll actually follow up with an email on what some of those options are. I've been meaning to write a blog post on what's out there. I know there's a CMS Wire paper that's out there as well that has one of the different options. But great question, and the answer is you don't have to use if we did create something, you don't have to use what we created. We will do some, after we're done with the project, we can do some customizations. We're all about that. So if you want to make some changes to the way that SharePoint works, we can do, I know some good people who could do that for you. Exactly. So great question, Scott. Thanks for asking that. And I'll also follow up with you on email with that. Another question from Tom. What are the biggest user issues from moving from Jive to SharePoint? For example, training, management, use.
Well, people are used to using Jive in a certain way when they're using Jive, and then SharePoint you don't use things the same way. It's just, it has a different look. Right. And so, there's definitely some user training aspect to this where you want users to understand how to use SharePoint, what their stuff is going to look like once it's in SharePoint, and so I would think that's a big deal. From an IT perspective, totally different ways of managing the product too. So SharePoint's got a lot more to think about. Yeah.
I mean, it's also an opportunity to kind of unite with your users and kind of get in front of them and say, okay, we're switching to something. We're moving your cheese, but we're switching to something that's very powerful, going to give you a lot of capability. Most users find SharePoint pretty easy to pick up and use. Usually not an issue with that. So, but it gives you an opportunity to actually, schedule some time with your users and get in front of them and say, this is where this stuff's going to. This is how you actually take advantage of this now. And there may be things you couldn't even do before that you can do now.
And this may go along with all the communication, which is as you're rolling this out, we've got for years we've written about sort of SharePoint best practices, sort of how do you do this the right way and what we see in different organizations. And it really is it's a competency thing, which is you want to grow the competency of the organization as far as how it manages the information inside the organization. And if you're using SharePoint as a platform to do that, there are training aspects of it. There's just what ends up happening in a lot of these larger communities is you have power users that end up showing up. You have different people who are really take initiative in building out sort of their own solutions on SharePoint. And you just have to nurture and cultivate those people and really grow it into something that everybody's using. And so we have probably tens of blog posts that are out there as far as training types of things that you can do for building applications, and Microsoft has lots of materials on that as well. But you're moving somebody to a new platform, which is a very powerful platform, but with that it requires training and building up an internal competency around it. So I appreciate, looks like that's the last question, appreciate everybody taking the time to do this. I've been recording this, so I'll send out the recording of this to everyone, and so that you have it, and it'll be up on our website as well, so that you can share with others who might not have been able to attend this. And Chris, Kirk, you guys, phenomenal job, well done.
Thanks.
Look forward to doing more of these with you guys. I think it's giving people a choice. They don't have to feel like they're locked in, and that they have a choice that if they want to keep, what is important corporate IP, that knowledge that we have within an organization, that they can take it with them. That's a really empowering type of thing. So I appreciate what you guys are doing.
Cool. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody, for listening. Feel free. You can always reach out to me. If you go to the Contact Us page on our website, that comes to me, and I'll get back to you really soon. And if there are any other questions or anything else, feel free to reach out to me. And I appreciate you taking the time to do this, and have a wonderful day. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.